On this episode, I'm going to show you how I spice up MDF terrain. This episode is brought to you by Sumpin' Donuts, with a new location coming to the irradiated ruins of Baltimore City soon.
Dome Runners TV, your guide to the Underhive and beyond.
Hey there, scabby scummers and gangers. Crimson Oracle here with another episode of Dome Runners TV. And today we are going to be running through the process by which I spice up MDF terrain. I really like MDF terrain for practical reasons. 3D printing is a slow process. Buying MDF terrain, you get it and you can start assembling it right out of the gates. It is, of course, a compromise. The low expense of material cost combined with the speed is going to cost you in the realm of quality. But it doesn't have to be that way, because when you take an MDF kit and you assemble it and paint it, you have the opportunity to add back in a lot of detail that is missing from the original model. Now, this can involve 3D printing, it can involve buying or taking bits from your bits box. It can involve adding stuff from like the terrain crates and various other product lines. There are a lot of sources for that kind of stuff. You can even scratch build things to add onto it, like, adding pipes and such. There's a lot of different things that you can do to make MDF terrain have that third dimensionality that it often lacks. Just even by cutting plastic art or even cardboard and providing, trim details and raised surfaces and stuff can make a big difference. In this particular case, I'm going to show how I take a Ruin Motel model from TT Combat, which is a lovely model, as you can see here. It is a great kit. It was like $30 at my local game store, and it is huge. It takes up a ton of space. It's a centerpiece potentially for a Fallout game. I would like to add one more component from the motel line that they have, because it's only like 2 or 3 rooms in the actual kit, and obviously most motels have more than that, so I'd like to have another block of rooms to add, just because that's the kind of thing that I really want to have to sort of make it a better set piece. But even with just this, combined with my other terrain, this is going to be a fantastic addition that allows me to provide a little bit more variety of environments for my Fallout games. And I'm really excited for that, and I wanted to do this piece justice. So I went ahead and gave it the works. This is overkill for a lot of people. You don't have to do all of these steps. You could probably do this project in half as many steps and still get a model that looks great at the end. It just won't quite have as much, a depth that you can kind of get lost in. And that's what I'm really looking for with my terrain. I'm always trying to kind of, I guess it's because I didn't get to play with dollhouses enough as a kid. I really have turned the modeling hobby into dollhouse building. And this is, of course, what a Fallout dollhouse would look like. So I'm very excited to show it off, and I hope that people can kind of catch on to what I'm doing here and, integrate that into your future terrain projects, because MDF terrain does not have to look bad. MDF terrain can be absolutely spectacular. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease. With that, let's get to it.
If you like our content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and for as little as $2 a month you can become a patron and help support the show.
We're going to be using a variety of paints, all of which are included right here. So here we have the Motel 66 model. This is the main office plus upstairs suite. And I built everything, to standard. And I like the model a lot, but I do think that it needs a little bit of improvement. So I start off with the set dressing. I just wanted to kind of get a feel for what would fit in the room. I printed the Modifius version of these particular accessories at 75% because I wanted there to be more room to kind of maneuver and use the room. At 100%, they're just a little bulky. Now, of course, every good apocalyptic ruin has a lot of rubble. I make rubble by chopping up bits of sprue and various things that I have lying around. So a lot of needlepoint mesh that I use for various modeling projects, and lots of bits of resin. Resin's nice because it kind of shatters a little bit, so you get a variety of shapes. It doesn't kind of crunch the way that plastic does. I like to include wires in my mix of rubble. MDF left over from the actual build itself is another good option. And of course, bits of metal and even other plastic bits. And so what we're going to do is create rubble piles. Now, I really like to do this in a way where it kind of seems like things have, you know, fallen and gathered and accumulated over time. So obviously, you know, the roof will have caved in, and then, you know, maybe there was some bits of scaffolding or support or something that, you know, there was, you know, the underlayment of the roof, like, you know, could be like a mesh kind of texture, and then you just kind of mix large pieces, and then around the large pieces you put smaller pieces, and then I like to use a very fine gravel that I get at the craft store in order to kind of finish things off, and having little pieces that kind of jut into gaps and across things is another good way to kind of create more organic looking fallen debris. Now, I'm going to do this for the entire model. It's not a fast process, especially if you want to manually place everything instead of sort of just putting down a bunch of spots of glue and then dumping out your bits box. But I prefer to have a little bit more thought to how these things are laid out. So I kind of, you know, gradually put in all these bits, and I do know that, of course, I'm going to be putting the set dressing in later, so I avoid the areas where I did want to put those down, because I'm going to glue them down, obviously. And yeah, we just sort of get in there and get everything to the point where it's, you know, looking busy and good. Now, you're probably thinking that it looks a little bit not quite integrated into the environment. We're actually going to deal with that in the next step. But first, you know, you get the rubble down, and then you worry about kind of meshing that rubble into the really flat looking MDF, which we're going to use a texture paint for that. Now, of course, along the stairs, a lot of broken bits and all of that, I think helps them look a little bit more interesting and a little bit less like a MDF kit that's been sort of pre-weathered. Now, I really like the base model, but I did think that it could use a little bit more of wood barricades that people would have put up at various points, so I went ahead and added a few with popsicle sticks. That's a very easy bit of detail that you can add that really helps kind of spice up the various builds that you might do with MDF. Adding your own little additions really helps. And now, finally, is the time of putting in the set dressing. Very excited to drop all of that in. I did make sure that there was space for it. You could probably put the set dressing in first. There wasn't a particular reason why I didn't. I don't actually, you know, I don't know why I did that, but regardless, I went ahead and put 2 beds in here since it's sort of the master, you know, suite. And I go ahead and actually broke the legs of the television in order to have that kind of look broken and caved in. And now the secret sauce. I gave the recipe that I use for this stuff in my first Battlefield on a Budget video, but essentially it is a mixture of fine sand, the fine gravel, and the it's actually going to be powdered flock in this case, mixed with glue and water to create a variety of textures that can be applied with a brush. It is a very fun material to play with. It's great for making bases. It's great for, you could add pigment to it in order to use it for weathering. You can, you know, put it, use it as that kind of texture paint that GW sells or that Vallejo sells, that is significantly cheaper because you make it, and you can make it in absolutely massive quantities. So I'm going to be using a lot because I'm covering the entire motel with this stuff, and it's going to be applied in a very uneven fashion, particularly along the walls. I'm going to water it down a little bit more and brush it on so that a thinner layer sticks. This is absolutely the most crucial part of this build. If you don't texture the MDF, you will not get the same kind of results when you start applying the paints, because we're going to be using a lot of dry brushing and a lot of washes, and without the inherent texture that this material provides, you wind up with flat panels, and that's really the thing that makes MDF look like MDF. It's the thing that kind of makes you look at an MDF building and go like, oh, okay. But if you can add texture to the MDF, obviously flat parts can be totally fine if it's, clean construction, or whether like something for infinity, then you have to use other techniques painting wise in order to sort of properly get to the consistency that you want. In terms of color, you probably want to use airbrushing, gradients, and all that stuff. But for a ruin, we want to apply a nice thick layer of this texture compound, and when we are done, the end result will speak for itself. I find it particularly important to fill in the areas around these broken holes in the building. They have a sort of pre-planned rubble kind of look to them, and by caking in a lot of this stuff, it kind of makes the damage look a little bit more organic, and also like there is more accumulation of gunk over the centuries. I think that it helps a lot for making this look the best it can be, to be strategic about making sure that and every single one of those you get a nice dose of the texture paint. Of course, don't forget to do the undersides of surfaces. This is something that you can also do on your plastic kits, because a lot of them will have one-sided detail when it comes to terrain, and just adding that little bit of texture can really help with the, feel of the building and finally feeling right. Now, once the building is fully covered, you are going to want to leave this to sit for a while. You don't have to have it be 100% cured before you prime. You can prime over it when it's like at 80 or 90%, but I do not recommend trying to paint when this stuff is wet. You will just ruin whatever brushes you use. Obviously, as you can see, I use a terrible quality brush for these applications, because it's just going to damage the hell out of anything you put this stuff into. And here we have it. The motel just needs to sit and dry, and it's ready to prime. I went ahead and primed it a brown from the craft store. I use a lot of craft paint for terrain, but keep in mind that all of these techniques can be used with whatever paints you like. You don't have to use the brands I'm using. So first off, we are going to start by stippling on a very dark brown. I like to use dark umber from Pro Acryl, but you could easily get away with using whatever particular brand that you like, or craft store paint, or what have you. And I'm sort of just putting it on with a rough brush that I mostly use for dry brushing, in sort of a splotchy pattern across the whole model. You will notice that I start out using a brush for a lot of this work, but at some point I'm going to transition to using a sponge. Now, we're going to come in and paint all of the wood with dark golden brown Pro Acryl. This one is a nice starting point for the wood. You can then kind of dry brush over it and give it more of a natural look. Of course, we're going to be doing a lot of weathering, so not a large amount of original colors here are going to come through, but it's always good to lay down the base. And you do want to make sure you get the insides of all of the windows and of course all of the furniture that might be wooden. You can paint the furniture that is wooden different shades of brown if you want. Personally, for a project like this where we're going to be applying a heavy layer of weathering over top of everything, I tend to stick to a pretty basic palette of colors for the stuff that is underneath. And of course I also hit some of the rubble. Now we're going to come in with the coal black pro acryl. Any black paint will do, of course. And once again, we are just stippling on with a brush. I tend to go lighter with the black in terms of the amount that I put down with each press, and then come back in and do a little bit thicker layers on certain parts, like the holes in the building and the roof tiles and various parts of rubble, which were more likely to be made of metal and thus be getting a bit of silver when I come around and do the silver coat later. This all just sort of gives more of a feeling of the building being worn, and it creates a nice weathering pattern, breaking up the browns with the black. And I always use this in weathering a brown object. Next, we're going to come in with a light brown. I like to use light umber from Pro Acryl. This is going to, provide some contrast over the dark base and the slightly different darker brown that we stippled on earlier. What we're trying to do is create the appearance of the depth of this material, that there's different things caked on, different dirts, different consistencies of dirt. Some of it might be more of a wet mud, some of it might be, dry and dusty, and as a result you get this nice mixing of different browns together. And we're really going to kick that up a notch later when we start using some of the effects paint, but this is a good start. Next, we're going to come in with the bright Ivory Pro Acryl on a sponge, and here we are going to be creating the ruins of the paint job of the building before it fell into this state. Now, I could have done this with a chipping method, but because I layer so much on top of it, dealing with kind of spraying on or painting on over the chipping fluid, just isn't worth the extra effort versus just using a sponge, which creates a broken appearance, and then everything we do on top of it will just sort of build on that. Next, we are going to put down the building's trim. And I'm not going to use a sponge for this simply because the trim is fine enough that it would most likely result in paint spilling over that I would need to clean up. So it's just simpler to brush it on because, again, we're going to be putting a lot of extra paint on top of this that will break it up and make it look quite weathered. Since I was going for a classic motel look, I thought a red would be a good color. I associate, roadside motels with having red incorporated in their design in some way. I don't know why that is, but I stayed in a lot of them as a kid, and this is just what my brain goes to. So red is where we went with it, and I'm going to use red, white obviously as the base color, and then brown for the doors and the roof. For the accents on the doors and the roof, I decided to go once again with the dark golden brown from Pro Acryl. This is one of my favorite paints for doing kind of a woody look as the sort of base color, and then I tend to highlight on top of it to give it a little bit more detail. This is a basic, simple color scheme. I could have gone with something a little bit bolder, but ultimately the base colors just aren't that important because the grime is going to be taking center stage. So I wanted a nice simple backdrop to sort of layer the grime on top of. But I could have gone with green for the roof, for example, and it still would have worked. I came around and put down a bit of the bright ivory on the floors too. I figure that there was, some kind of a floor situation, maybe a carpet or something, that is this color that, yes, it's the same color as the walls, but really my goal here is for something that's going to take a wash well and really help give more depth to the textures and appearance of this object. Now we are going to then come in with a very light dry brush of the same bright ivory, just going across every little bit of raised texture, again extremely light, because we're just trying to impart, you know, just a little bit more depth. These changes in color, these gradients, create the impression of depth in your brain. And what we're really trying to do here is create more visual information than someone can process at once. You're trying to make the scene busy in a way that is naturalistic, which is why we're using techniques like these, you know, natural materials being sort of glooped on, you know, dry brushing, stippling, all of this stuff, sponging. You're giving more sort of small detail that doesn't look planned or organized or patterned. And as a result, the final appearance of the object creates the impression of depth. Now, once we're done with the white dry brush, we're going to come in with a khaki dry brush, and we're going to apply this a little bit more haphazardly. The goal here is to have a variety of colors that will interact with the various washes and other things that we use in order to create, you know, more, again, depth, detail, all of that. Now, I really like dry brushing for this over airbrushing because while it takes a little bit longer, it is much more natural looking. Dry brushing is very chaotic, very random, especially when you're using a junky brush like I am. Now I'm going to come in and do the little details on the sign in olive flesh. It's a slightly different white than the other whites I'm working with. Next, we are going to sponge on black, particularly around the areas of damage, around the holes and the breaks and all that. This is going to once again create more visual information. It creates the appearance of grime and dirt, and it works over top of browns, blacks, whites, etc. So black is always part of my, you know, layering process here. Next, we're going to come in and stipple on a dark silver on top of the various surfaces, which were metallic at one point. So some of the rubble, the trim on the beds, you know, the computer, the television, that sort of stuff. Obviously, it also includes the signs and the door handles. This is, you know, a choice that I'm making. You could have these signs be wood underneath instead of metal, but I just like the effect that the rust that I'm going to be using has, so I decided to treat the signs as if they were made out of metal. It's fantastic paint that actually oxidizes after you put it down. Depending on the amount of liquid to the sort of solid compound that you use, you can get a very dark brown rust, or you can get a very bright florid orange rust. I'm going with a very, very wet application here to ensure that we get this nice, beautiful bright orange rust emerging. Now, this stuff is not cheap. It's a pretty big expense to pick up a bottle, but it will last you a long time because you got to remember you're only using very small amounts of rust paint. But please, please, please make sure you shake it very, very thoroughly. You need that thing to rattle around inside, otherwise it will all come out liquid. Now we're going to switch over to using a bunch of Vallejo's effect paints. We're going to start with Engine Grime. This is a sort of gray-brown, dirty, slightly glossy effect paint. It is a really good one for, you know, creating the appearance of kind of dust and grime and gunk that is still fresh or a little bit wet. Now, it's not necessary to use these specific products. I know that I've already mentioned that, but in this case, these are really fun because they have very cool consistency and they work really well for presenting this kind of variety that I'm looking for. But you can absolutely achieve this just by getting a broad spectrum of browns and mixing in some gloss medium. Again, brown splash mud Vallejo effect paint. This is a great one. It is, you know, once again, a variety of color, and it's muddy and it's a very deep, beautiful brown. And I like to combine that with the engine grime because dirt and grime and filth often are multiple different tones and colors and consistencies. So this gives you just a nice mix. Now we're going to use some of Vallejo's European Earth pigment to create a kind of pigment wash. I mix in water with the pigment, and this is not going to fix the pigment to the model. We're going to use a actual acrylic wash in the next step that will serve as our fixer. But I like to put this down because it is a really wonderful effect when this dries, especially if you get it nice and watery, which is really crucial. You don't want to be kind of caking this on for this particular effect. You can totally cake it on in other applications, but see, here I'm trying to create, because I've already put down a few different types of dirty colors, I'm trying to create that more kind of surface level dust appearance. You know, you've got these sort of fine granules of pigment that will be lifting up once the the water evaporates, and will give you this nice chalky, matte, beautiful effect. Now we're going to come in with a black wash. I'm going particularly dark for this one because it's a ruin. I like to use the black to kind of blend things a little bit and, you know, fill in sort of fine details. I personally make this wash using a mixture of coal black pro acryl and the Vallejo Express Color Medium. I have been mixing my own washes for years, and originally I started with inks. What I've really been enjoying lately is using Contrast Medium and Vallejo Express Medium because they allow you to get the exact right amount of pigment on the fly. I find that inks are so pigment dense that it can be a little bit difficult to actually get the right weight that you want. Here is where things really get fun and get taken to the next level. We're going to be applying a variety of tufts, sphagnum moss that's been dyed different colors, and foam foliage that I got at my local craft store. This is used for like dioramas and such. The tufts are gamer's grass in this case, and I cannot swear by their products more. They are absolutely the best tufts I've ever used. I don't even really use static grass for the role of static grass anymore because there's so many wonderful tufts available, and gamer's grass is, in my opinion, the best of the best. The flowers, these sort of ferny looking, you know, overgrown tufts, there's just so much more detail than in a lot of the other brands. Granted, the other brands are fine. I don't have any complaints about, you know, the Army Painter or, you know, whatever other brand of tuft out there. But I really particularly like this brand, and the sphagnum moss is another really important element of this because you want these sort of creeping viney looking things, and the sphagnum moss is nice and big, and it can be broken up to be whatever shape you want, and it can allow you to kind of create these drooping hanging bits. Because if you ever look at ruins of an abandoned building, which is something that I have a particular fascination with and have spent a lot of time in my life sort of, you know, looking at and visiting and all this stuff, because decay fascinates me. Notice I also play Death Guard, etc. But I really enjoy creating these sort of naturalistic elements. It is important to create a wide mix of all of these different colors throughout the model. You don't want to put too much of one thing in one place. Really mix it up, because you don't want it to look, you know, gardened or planned. You want it to look haphazard, like it was created naturally. So now the foliage is down, we want to apply a powdered flock in various spots around the model. So put glue down. I use super glue. You could easily use white glue for this. And you want to surround foliage with this sort of, you know, more subtle greenery that this particular flock imparts. I'm going with one that's sort of a greenish brown. This can be, you know, kind of read visually as moss or as dirt. It'll really help blend your foliage into the environment, which again just creates a more natural look. And that's all we're really trying to accomplish here. I like to get some on the walls as well, because dirt and moss will accumulate on walls and give them that sort of lived on feel. You thought we were done with painting, but guess what? There's one more little bit of paint left. This is the Rainmark effect paint from Vallejo. Once again, you could probably achieve this effect with a particularly matte gray, kind of tan gray color, but I, of course, have these Vallejo effects lying around, and I like to use them. So that's what I'm using here. And you come in and just sort of do little bits of streaks, because of course this thing is sitting out in the rain. So there would be, on top of everything else, you know, these rain marks that would form in places. Don't go overboard with it. It's just really here, once again, to create a different variety of sort of shape of color, because it is this sort of natural flowing line pattern. It's a little bit different from the sponging and the dry brushing and all the stuff that we've done before. We were done? Not quite. There's one more little extra touch that will just kick this thing up that extra notch, and that is to take some clear plastic from some packaging. In this case, it's actually packaging from some of the flock that I'm using, and you cut it down into pieces that look kind of believable as bits of broken window glass, and then you're going to take your super glue and you're going to glue these little panes of broken glass into the remains of the window in the model. And this is obviously extra. You know, you really don't have to do this in order to achieve a good level of realism in your project, but anything worth doing is worth overdoing, right? So this is what is going to separate your project from someone else's. And of course, once the window panes are applied, I like to throw a little bit of some of the dirt onto that. You could use weathering pigment. You can use, here I'm just throwing on some Vallejo engine grime just to make the glass look dirty. And that is going to be it. We have finally completed this project, and it is, I think, a real showstopper. And there you have it. The model is done. And I think it's worth a little bit of extra effort it takes. You could probably airbrush them all like this in, you know, as little as half an hour, 40 minutes, and knock it out and be happy with it. But it's not going to have that same alive feeling that you're going to get by spending the extra time to do it, you know, quote unquote, properly. I don't want to disparage the way anyone else does their models. I love quick paint jobs because they're very effective at getting stuff on the table, but this is what I aim for in all of my terrain projects. I really want this level of attention to detail, and that's why I'm so passionate about 3D printing and why I really love the Modifius stuff, because it is so good for dressing up these scenes. I couldn't be happier. And shout out to TT Combat. This was a $30 model at my local game store. It was so reasonably priced. It takes up so much space. I really want to get another bit of the motel to pair with this so that I can have, you know, a sort of a bigger set piece for, you know, setting games in. But this will perfectly complement my Red Rocket terrain that I'm also going to be doing a video on in the next few days. So stay tuned for that. Thanks as always to Carl Casey at White Bat Audio for the show's music. And of course, thank you to my patrons. You guys make all of this possible. I couldn't do it without your support. And as always, if you would like to support the show, you can hop on over to patreon.com/domerunners. For as little as $2 a month, you can help keep this show coming. Of course, don't forget to check out the Dome Runners podcast, domerunners.buzzsprout.com, or your favorite podcast platform. And everybody out there, please, please, please stay safe, and don't forget to change your paint water.